Joining us, and welcome to our last day of Nebraska Invasive Species Awareness Week. My name's Shannon. I'm the Nebraska Invasive Species Council Coordinator, and we're super excited to have you all joining us. So, I did want to make one last announcement for our event tomorrow if you're located at or near Lincoln, Nebraska. So we are sort of closing out our first ever Nebraska Invasive Species Awareness Week with Know Your Nebraska Invasives Day. And it's going to be from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. tomorrow at Pawnee State Recreation Area. So we hope that you'll be able to join us. And now I will get into our last presentation. So our last presentation is going to be Weeds, 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 Nebraska's Invasive Aquatic Plants. And our presenter is Chris Stahr. So Chris is the Nebraska Game and Park Commission's Aquatic Invasive Species Program Manager since the program was created in 2020. He first began working with aquatic invasive species as a temporary in Iowa in 2009. Since then, he has worked with aquatic invasive species and aquatic vegetation in multiple other states, such as South Dakota, Oklahoma, and Arizona. And I'm going to let him present now. If you have a question, you'll see at the bottom of Zoom, there's a little bar and there's a tab that says Q&A. So you can type your question in there and then Chris will answer questions at the end. So without further ado, Chris, please feel free to take it away.
Awesome. Thank you. Is my slide showing okay?
It is.
Perfect. Well, thank you for joining us today. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the aquatic invasive species that's often overlooked, and that's our invasive aquatic the plants. So this is the time of year where I start to get a lot of phone calls from members of the public who are reporting in or sharing their thoughts about the vegetation growing in our lakes and rivers. And I thought this would be a really good um, a topic to cover just to kind of, you know, do an overview of what we have in Nebraska and what we're doing about it. So it's kind of a tale of souls time, right? So, I get a lot of calls and talk to a lot of boaters and anglers that they go to the lake, they're expecting a fun day, they're casting their line out, and all they capture are just what they call moss or seaweed. And then they usually call me and they're upset and they're wondering what we're going to do about it. So I wanted to, really shift how we think about aquatic plants and discern between our beneficial native aquatic plants and our truly invasive aquatic plants that we have in Nebraska. So, if you talk to most boaters and anglers, I just got a call this morning from someone, a private lake that basically wanted their lake just devoid of all vegetation, like a swimming pool. Much of the time, the aquatic plants are thought of as kind of all negative, right? They're just monsters. They're inconvenient. They're always in the way. They're just impeding recreation and things like that. But we really need to think about, like I mentioned, the difference between our invasive plants and our native plants, which really do perform a host of beneficial functions to our aquatic ecosystem. So first, I want to start off. What are aquatic plants? So it's not seaweed like I get calls a lot. It's not moss. Moss doesn't grow under the water. We really have four main groups here. We have algae, the emergent vegetation, submerged vegetation, and floating aquatic plants. So, algae are single cell organisms that, can be in the bottom of the lake, they can be on top. They form, these mats across the top of the water. They can be kind of stringy, like this filamentous algae right here. So, these are kind of the most simple of our four aquatic plant groups. Next, we have emergent vegetation. What does that mean? So, emergent vegetation are plants that are their life history is basically designed to grow out of the water. So that's where most of the biomass or the growth occurs above the surface. That's kind of what they're meant to do in their life cycle. What we really are talking about a lot when people are talking about weeds or seaweed or moss is submerged vegetation. So, these are plants that evolved to basically live their entire life cycle beneath the water surface. They may have a few flowers or leaves that stick out, but the bulk of that growth occurs below the water surface. And then lastly, we have what we call floating plants. So these are not like algae, although they often get misunderstood. Then this lower right-hand picture, we have duckweed, and each little leaf of there is its own individual plant that flowers that has the whole life cycle. So it's a little bit different from our algae, and this is what you usually see on the top of sloughs and things like that. So, those are kind of our four main groups that we have here. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about weeds. So weeds is often a very misunderstood word. So weed just means any plant that grows where it's not wanted. It could be native, it could be non-native. So like think the dandelion in your yard. Uh, that's a native weed. When we're talking about true invasive plants, we're talking about a non-native species. So that's naturally occurring outside of our area, and it causes some form of harm. Could be ecological, could be cultural, it could be economical even. So we talk a lot about the difference between weeds and invasive species. There are invasive weeds, but there's also native weeds, and that's kind of one, the difference that can kind of be hard to get your head around sometimes. So like I mentioned, I wanted to talk is oftentimes I talk to them anglers and boaters, and they just think all aquatic plants are bad. For healthy ecosystems, we need aquatic plants, and they have a host of beneficial functions for our aquatic ecosystems, but between providing refuge or places to hide for bugs and zooplankton, which baby fish need and other larger animals need. They provide nursery habitat spots for baby fish to hide in, so they grow large enough before they can spawn and things like that. One of the big things that we talk a lot about is it helps prevent bank erosion. It helps buffer some of that wind and wave action that would otherwise just try to erode some of that sediment on the bank. It does help maintain clean water because it does, them uptake them a host of nutrients and other things that occur within the water. And then obviously it provides oxygen. That's one thing that, especially our the fish animals in the water need. I work a lot up in the sandhills, and up there, aquatic plants are so important for our waterfowl, both endangered, like a whooping crane and other things like that. And there's a host of other things that, I could, give them a 1 hour webinar just on the benefits of aquatic plants. But the problems, and this is what we really talk about, the difference between weeds and invasive, really occur when a lake is invaded or if these plants become overabundant. Because healthy waters really need they really need healthy aquatic plant the populations. So now we're kind of moving into what are we doing at game and parks for aquatic plant management. So Jenna touched touched on some of these things in her webinar the other day on zebra mussels. So the Nebraska Aquatic Invasive Species Program was established in 2020. We were one of the very last states to really to create a standalone program just dedicated to aquatic invasive species. Prior to this program's establishment, pretty much all the aquatic plant management was done haphazard. It was done by people who maybe didn't know what they were doing, maybe they didn't know what was growing. So, one of the first things that we try to do is create a standard, structured aquatic plant survey across the state, which had not been done before. So one of the goals of this program is to conduct aquatic plant surveys on public water bodies. So these really have two main functions. The first is just to document what plants are growing in our waters. This is really important when we talk about the Nebraska Legacy Project, where we want to record species that are in decline, that are native to Nebraska, that are only found in Nebraska. And we need to start conservation efforts for those species. But really, the main reason why we do these surveys is to detect these invasive aquatic plants. Much like all the invasive species that you've heard about, detecting these populations early gives us the best chance of success at effectively managing these species. So one of the things that we have really been starting to ramp up, and I'll talk about this towards the end of my presentation, are chemical applications with herbicide on invasive plants. And this is where, I talk to a lot of boaters and they want me to treat certain lakes and rivers for a plant. But the way that our program is structured, we really focus on the invasive aquatic plants, the true invasive, just because, it's a native plant that's very, very abundant and it's kind of a weed. We don't really handle as much of that because we have such an issue with invasive aquatic plants in Nebraska. So how do we do our plant surveys? So, we kind of have two main types of surveys that we do. The first is what I like to call an investigative survey. So, this is where we're just trying to document what's in the lake. So we're trying to find invasives there, or we're trying to document all the natives there. So this is by going around the perimeter of the lake by these red dots here. We actually throw out, it's not a very high-tech method. We actually have a double-sided garden rake that we weld together and it's on a rope and we throw it out and we drag it in and we ID every single species of plant that we find on it down to a little piece of a leaf. We try to ID it. So we go around the lake, we throw this rake out, this rake out, and we try to identify all the things that we find. Now, if we find an invasive species, then we're going to come back and do what I would like to call a treatment survey. So this is where we're going to do a much more intensive survey. We're going to go run transects or lines across the lake and try and get a bigger picture of what the problem and the scope of the problem is. Because oftentimes when we do an investigative survey and we capture it in a few places, it may not really tell the full story that's going on. We may have a lot larger issue than we think. We may have a lot less of an issue than we think. So, these are the two types of surveys that we do in Nebraska. So if you see me out on a boat this summer and you see a kind of a weird looking guy that's throwing a rope out with a rake into it, that's me doing these surveys. So I talked about the benefits of aquatic plants. I talked about how we sample them. Um, Next, we're going to talk about the true negative impacts of our invasive aquatic plants. So I mentioned, the most healthy aquatic ecosystems has a diverse amount of native plants. They all grow at different times of year. They all serve different functions. It doesn't grow too dense, so fish can still move throughout it, but doesn't also impede recreation. Obviously the first big impact of any invasive species, but it's really important for invasive aquatic plants is it really outcompetes these native species. You know, Much of our invasive aquatic plants are much more efficient at trying to uptake these nutrients that we find in the water, which allows them to really grow fast and really shade out a lot of our native species. I've worked with Nebraska Public Power District out in Lake Maloney where they're having some weed problems, and it really does help, to understand the impact of invasive aquatic plants on the reduction in water and how it flows. So our nuclear power stations, our coal-fired power stations, and even just irrigation canals. When we have a large, huge, dense stand of these invasive aquatic plants, it really reduces the water flow. They clogs this water infrastructure that we need for a variety of purposes. And the next is kind of where we talk about outcompeting native species. The one thing is these invasive aquatic plants, once they get established, is they form these really dense canopies. So, you think of like a forest where it's really tightly packed together. There's hardly any sunlight getting down at the bottom of the forest, so there's really nothing else can grow. The same thing happens in a lake, where down at the bottom of the substrate, even though that there's seeds down there, these native plants can't establish and can't grow. I talked about one of the benefits of aquatic plants is during the day they have photosynthesis, so they produce oxygen. When we have a really large biomass, so I'm talking a really large, like 100% of the lake is just choked with aquatic plants, this can actually reduce oxygen because at night, these plants respire. So they're using all the oxygen in the water, which can lead to fish kills in certain instances. Another big way, and this is what a lot of my research had been done when I worked in Oklahoma, is how invasive aquatic plants try to alter the food web. So when we've had these really dense stands, it's hard for a predatory fish to find their way through them. So that can make it a lot harder for some of these species to find the prey that we need. And obviously the big one that I talk about is it harms and reduces recreation. So, you go to the lake, you're excited to fish, you get there and you just look out and all the shore access is just chock with weeds. So, that boater or angler may decide to go someplace else or may decide to go home. So, that's a loss in both recreation dollars, but all the association dollars that go with it between hotels and gas the local economy. So like this is a much larger problem when we think about just kind of being, frustrated that there's weeds at your favorite fishing hole. This goes much, much larger in scope. And, this is why it's one of these often overlooked invasives compared to some of the other ones like zebra mussels or Asian carp. So in Nebraska, we have what I call the big three. So we have three main invasive aquatic plants in this state. The first is Eurasian water milfoil. So Eurasian water milfoil, like the name implies, is native to Europe and Asia. We do have a native species of water milfoil called northern water milfoil, and I'll talk about the difference here in a second. But all water milfoil basically has a whorl or just four leaves around the stem, perpendicular to each other. And these species really reproduce via seed, but primarily fragmentation. Now, what does that mean? That means that this plant and pretty much all of our invasive aquatic plants means if a little piece of one little leaf breaks off that plant and falls down to the surface, it can create a whole new plant. So it's really hard to control because, we talk a lot about boats and boater movement. Motorized boats is the reason how this plant spreads because, you think about your propeller and things like that. One little leaf gets on there, and if people don't take the time to clean, drain, dry, and go launch their boat before that watercraft is completely dry, you're just spreading a whole new plant in a lake, and it may just be a little tiny fragment. So the difference between our usual invasive the Eurasian water milfoil and our northern native water milfoil is by counting the number of leaflets per side. Now, what does that mean? So here I have two pictures of leaves, and a leaflet is just on one of these leaves, and we blow it up. We're going to count the number of leaflets just on one side. So here on northern water milfoil, we can count. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So northern water milfoil, the native plant, typically has less than 10 leaflets per side. Northern milfoil also, when you take it out of the water, remains somewhat stiff compared to Eurasian. If you take Eurasian water milfoil out of the water, it's very, very limp, kind of like a cooked piece of spaghetti. Now, Eurasian water milfoil also has a much greater than 10 leaflets per side. As you can see the difference between these two here. If we wanted to actually count these, we're talking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, around 16 or 17 leaflets per side. So, these two species look very similar, but they do act drastically different. Like I mentioned in this picture in the lower right-hand corner, Eurasian water milfoil can grow up to 20 feet deep. That's top to bottom, and it will fold up on top. So it really does just completely take over a water body. And then one other wrinkle that we kind of had with Eurasian water milfoil in Nebraska, which I had never seen before, is we do have this species up at Lewis and Clark Reservoir. And if you watched Jenna's presentation the other day, that water body also has zebra mussels there. And one thing that we found with our inspections is we've actually found zebra mussels attaching to the stems of this plant. So, zebra mussels are typically attached to hard, non-porous surfaces, but now we're seeing them attached to another invasive species. So when a boat comes out of a lake like Lewis and Clark, and with a bunch of weeds on its trailer, on its boat, it's not only has a risk of spreading this invasive aquatic plant. Now I got to worry about spreading invasive aquatic zebra mussels. So again, it's often not just one thing, and these things like to compound and make an even greater risk. So in Nebraska, we do have unfortunately several water bodies with Eurasian water milfoil. I should mention, if you want to see all the specific water bodies, I encourage you to go to outdoornebraska.gov/aquatic invasive species. You can see this map. Actually, we just took it right off the website, but it also has a list of all the lakes that we found Eurasian water milfoil in, as does the fishing guide. So in Nebraska, we kind of have what I like to call three main pockets of milfoil. We have a Lincoln Omaha pocket, where these lakes are often close together. They're more recreationalist, so they like to hop from one water body to another, and that's kind of how this species got spread, especially throughout the Omaha area. Next, we have what I call the I-80 corridor. So we have actually a lot of water bodies along I-80 between Grand Island and just outside North Platte with with invasive milfoil. Now, we have so many I-80 sand pits along the river, just along the interstate. And often what people do is if they're not catching fish at one, there's usually one just down the road, and they don't take the time to do our clean, drain, dry protocols. And it's so easy for a piece of a leaf to get stuck on a propeller or a trailer, and they just spread it from one water body to another. Next, we also have kind of the last bigger pocket, and this is the pocket that's been expanding most, is out in the Panhandle. So we have it in Box Butte and a few of the other reservoirs in western Nebraska. And as you can see, it's quite far away from all these other vectors that we have. So we're pretty confident that these species here, like, are being spread from out of state. So, if we talk about aquatic plant management in surrounding states like Wyoming, Colorado, and South Dakota, it's practically non-existent. So they don't really do any aquatic plant management here. So, this just shows that the risk is not only from our established populations in the state of Nebraska, but from out of state just across our borders. So, like, this is why we like to do these plant surveys so we really can catch it early and try and discern some of these patterns of its spread. The second of the big three invasive aquatic plant that we have in Nebraska is curly leaf pondweed. So if you've been out this spring, especially in southeast Nebraska, there's probably a very high likelihood that you've seen this plant. So curly leaf pondweed has very distinctive lasagna-shaped leaves, as I call it. You can see the ruffles here. It's widespread in the central United States. I would say it's pretty much all over Kansas and Iowa, South Dakota. And the reason that this plant is so hard to manage is this plant will actually start growing underneath the ice. I've heard stories from ice fishermen who have been out in January and they put their live scope down and they're seeing little sprouts of this plant already start growing. This plant does die back by midsummer, and you think that'd be a good thing that by the middle of June most of it's died and dying back, and the wood nymphs come back. The problem is all that decomposing, decaying vegetation can result in oxygen being depleted because oxygen is needed for decomposition. So it can actually by itself cause a fish kill or an algal bloom just from its life cycle. Just like the Eurasian water milfoil, this plant spreads by fragmentation. So a little piece of a leaf breaks off, can form a whole new plant. I get asked a lot on all these species. You see down in Florida and other spots down in the southeastern United States that have really big plant problems. They have these big mechanical harvesters that will pretty much go like a lawnmower across the lake. I always discourage people from doing that because what you're doing is creating hundreds of thousands of brand new plants because these leaves break off. The one big challenge of curly leaf pondweed compared to Eurasian water milfoil is this plant does like to spread by seed as well. So this plant spreads by what we call torions, and you can actually see one down here. So the torion, like think of it kind of like a pine cone. So this torion is a hard seed-like structure. It grows at the top of the plant, and what it does is when it starts to die back for the year, it releases these hard torions, and they fall down to the sediment and the substrate and the muck. And then next year, they already have a built-in source to grow. So it makes it very, very difficult to control. This is the very first year. This spring, we were actually out in April. We were doing some experimental early season herbicide treatments. So our plan was to try and control this plant before it gets a chance to produce these torions. So, we treated Four Lakes this spring. We treated Ravenna by Kearney, Prairie View in Omaha, Mascantine by Norfolk, and Smith WMA, kind of halfway between Valentine and Alliance. And the early results from our treatment is that it went very, very well. So our plan is to go back this summer and actually take basically a big shovel and look through the muck and see how many of these torions that we can find. And then the second part of this study is to actually go back and treat the exact same weights, the exact same water bodies I mentioned next year. So we're hoping to deplete all those seeds in the substrate, but get rid before it captures more. So that way that we can achieve more season-long control. So curlyleaf pondweed is very widespread in Nebraska. I do share this map, but this map has kind of a caveat. Like I mentioned, this plant usually dies back by the middle of June. And frankly, we only have two full-time staff in our program, myself and Jenna Poggles. And it's incredibly difficult to make it to water bodies across the state before this plant dies back, because I could go back the end of June, a lake that had 100% coverage of curlyleaf pondweed, and I would find no evidence it was ever there. So that's just something that, I share this of spots that we know it's at, but I know for certain that it's in much more water bodies than we have listed on this map. And the last of our big three is our newest invasive aquatic plant, called brittle naiad. So brittle naiad is a highly branched plant with these little bumps on the stems here. You can almost see it on these pictures. So it looks similar to a couple of our native plants, coontail and spiny naiad. And this plant is even more difficult to control than both curlyleaf pondweed and Eurasian water milfoil. And why is that? That's because it spreads very easily through fragmentation, a lot like Eurasian water milfoil, but it has on the seed bank little tiny seeds like curlyleaf pondweed. So it's kind of the worst of both of those species. You put it together in a plant, and now we have a very difficult plant to control. In states surrounding us, like Iowa, it's at the risk of becoming naturalized, which means it's kind of everywhere. And trying to eradicate this from the landscape it may not be feasible. So this was first established by doing these early aquatic plant surveys, like I talked about at the beginning of our presentation. So Cramper Lake up at Danish Alps SRA, we were doing a standard aquatic plant survey, and I found this plant on the rake. That was our very first instance of this plant ever being detected in Nebraska. The following year, we did the same thing up at Lewis and Clark Lake. We found it there at the Wygon Marina. But the one that we're more worried about is Box Beat Reservoir out in the Panhandle. So last year we were doing again our typical aquatic plant investigative survey, and we found this plant pretty much throughout the entire lake. So I should mention that we had just done a plant survey the year before. So in a span of less than a year, this plant got introduced and was able to make its way all the way across the lake. The picture I showed you on the title slide of my presentation, that is actually of Box Beat Reservoir and all the brittle naiad that we have here. My biggest concern with this species is this brittle naiad has a very strong affinity for sandy habitat. So, if you're not familiar with our sandhill lakes, like near Valentine and the Valentine National Wildlife Refuge, we have, certain species and lakes up there that are found nowhere else in the state. So if this plant were to get into some of those ecosystems, it would be incredibly devastating. So this is a plant that we are kind of on high alert right now. We are looking all over near these other water bodies that we've already discovered it to hopefully get an idea at. But as of now, we only have it in 3 water bodies in the state. So I've talked a lot now about our big 3 aquatic invasive species, them in respect to plants. How do we control these species? And like I mentioned, with some of the difficulties between mechanical harvesting or people hand pulling, really the only way that we can control these species is through chemical application with herbicide. And that's why early detection is critical, because if we can find these species in only one little area, it's a much more likelihood that that we'll be successful and it won't spread to other water bodies. But if we catch it way late, it makes it much more difficult. So we use a few different herbicides depending on the plant that we need. So, the first step in treating any pest or plant with chemical is you have to be for certain what plant is it that you're growing, that you're treating. So, you can't just use one size fits all. We have very specific herbicides that we use for specific plants. So we use a variety of aquatic herbicides in our program. The 3 main herbicides that we use are Diquat, which is the brand name Reward, Fluoridone, which is under the brand name Sonar, And our newest herbicide that we've been using is called Procelacor. We go through extensive training on how to apply these herbicides, and all these herbicides I mentioned have no detrimental effect when applied properly on fish or aquatic wildlife. I often get talked to people that are at the lake while I'm doing these, and they're asking, is it safe to boat or fish or have my dog? And the vast majority of the time, it's completely safe for that. And there's little to no restrictions for recreation. Um, all of our applications are done by certified pesticide applicators, so which are certified by the Department of Agriculture. We have to take a test and things like that. I actually help teach the recertification class, so we are very, very mindful of the careful planning and preparation and how important that is. Like I mentioned, to any herbicide application, be it on land and in your field or in a lake. So that's why all this careful planning and preparation is not only adds to the successful chance of of getting rid of the species, but it also, we really want to be transparent in what we're doing. That's why often you'll see us send out like a press release. We're doing a pretty large scale chemical treatment, like the one I'm going to talk about next. So I wanted to talk about our most recent success that we've had when controlling invasive aquatic plants. At North Platte Lake, it's also known as Iron Horse Park. So it's literally right by the interstate in North Platte. What we discovered in 2023 is hybrid Eurasian water milfoil. Now, I didn't talk about this during the Eurasian water milfoil slide. Basically, what we have found in the upper Midwest is those two species I had mentioned, the invasive Eurasian and the native northern, they have been found to hybridize and makes a much more aggressive form. So think of it like super water milfoil. And the really big problem with that is this hybrid milfoil is resistant to the typical herbicides that we would use. This lake in North Platte had extensive angler access improvements. They had jetties put in, they had fishing piers to put in. They did, hundreds of thousands of dollars were put into this lake, but because of the weeds and this invasive milfoil, people still didn't come out to the lake. So this just shows again, I talked about that economical impact of invasive aquatic plants. This is just one example of that. So our only option was Procelacor herbicide. So Procelacor is the only chemical on the market that's specifically designed to kill hybrid Eurasian water milfoil. This lake was roughly 30 acres, and we used just under 7 gallons of herbicide, which doesn't sound like a lot. This chemical is incredibly expensive. It's over $4,000 a gallon. So just to treat this little lake in North Platte cost over $30,000. And this again shows how important it is to really detect these species early, because before our program was established, this plant had probably got into the lake. That if we were able to catch it early, it would be much, much cheaper, and we could have a greater chance at getting it eradicated. So this picture on the right, you can see how this milfoil is growing in 20 feet of water, all the way from the bottom all the way up to the surface. So it's very, very difficult to recreate on this water body. So we went out and treated it last year in July of 2024. Here are a few pictures from our treatment. So you can see our boat motor. This is fairly typical when we have invasive aquatic plants. It gets choked out your boat motor, makes it hard to boat, and we had to stop and clean off our propeller many, many times here. But you can see across the entire lake, especially in this lower right-hand corner, and I'll show you an after picture. So kind of remember this picture in the lower right-hand corner. You can see it growing to the top of the water pretty much throughout the entire water body. So it was an extensive, almost 100% of the lake was covered with invasive hybrid milfoil. And you can see us applying this chemical here in this lower left-hand picture. So, I talked about doing a treatment survey where we kind of put a grid across the lake and we sample, so we really know a good idea of the problem that we have. So I wanted to show you a couple pictures. So we went out and we treated, like I mentioned. So this is the day before we treated. So the red means that we had basically 100% milfoil. The green means there is little to none. And you can see how the vast majority of this water body is just completely covered with this invasive aquatic plant. And so we treated it in mid-July. We went back about 6 weeks later, and boy, did we see a difference. Just not even 6 weeks later, we found this lake had completely switched. So now we have the majority of the water bodies green, which means that plant is no longer detected, which was amazing. And even in the spots where we did still see some red and orange and yellow, although we were still detecting this invasive aquatic plant, this plant was actively dying. So like this just shows when you do the proper planning and preparation, how successful you can be. And when we went back even later in the year, we saw a completely different lake. You can see, like I mentioned that picture before, where that plant was growing top to bottom throughout the whole lake. Now we have a clean water body that's more beneficial for recreation, but also native aquatic wildlife like birds, turtles, and frogs. And you can see here in the right-hand picture, this is what this plant looks like when it's decomposing. It's brown, it's not bright green. So, and kind of knock on wood, this was a very successful treatment. And we're going to go back next year, this summer actually, and confirm that we really got rid of this plant. So, like, this is one of our greatest success stories of our program thus far. So, like, this is just one example of how we manage invasive aquatic plants. So how can you help us? So, our regulations state that you cannot arrive at or leave a water body with aquatic plant or plant fragments on your boat and trailer. So, before you leave a lake and before you get to another lake, you have to make sure that those fragments and any stems are off your boat and trailer. Because of how these plants are spread, like I mentioned, where just a little fragment can create a whole new plant and a whole new water body. That's why it's so important that you guys, really do the time and try to remove all these plants. We do watercraft inspections throughout the state. Most people think those are only for zebra mussels. We're also checking for invasive aquatic plants as well. That's why like I mentioned, it's so important that our program's motto is clean, drain, dry. Clean everything off the exterior of your watercraft, drain all the water that's inside your watercraft, because not only could that harbor things like zebra mussels, but could have little invasive plant fragments as well. And let that boat dry completely. That way, we make sure when you go to a new water body that you're not at the risk of spreading these invasive species. And one last thing I wanted to mention is please make sure. It's kind of like the airline motto that Jenna had mentioned on Tuesday. Don't assume that we know that a certain species is in a certain water body. Like I mentioned, we have a very small staff. We're a very dedicated staff, but please report the sightings to us. If you're at a lake and you're like, man, this is kind of a weird looking plant, I would rather you guys, take a picture and send it to me, and me tell you like, thanks, yep, that's Eurasian milfoil. We sampled it last year, but thank you for your report. Then this go undetected just because, like I mentioned, if we don't detect it early, it can be much more difficult to treat. So if you wanted to report sightings or ask questions or just find information, our contact info is right here. We have a phone number that you can call day or night and report wherever you see or have questions. It's 402-471-7602. We also have an email. It's ngpc.ais@nebraska.gov. That goes straight to myself and Jenna. So if you have pictures or anything like that, you could always shoot us an email. Jenna recently updated our website. So if you go to nebraska.gov/aquatic invasive species, like I mentioned before, you can look at all the lakes that we have these invasive species in, but also go here and fill out a report of sightings. So if you don't want to give us a call or shoot us an email, you can go right on our website, find all of our regulations and report sightings. And then one last thing I wanted to include is I do get a lot of calls, especially from private pond owners or people just really interested in aquatic plants. If you want some really good basic information, on this website here, aquaplant.tamu.edu, it's run by the Texas A&M Extension. It's really good. It can help you identify plants, and it can help you figure out what chemical to use to control these plants as well. So this is one I usually give to pretty much everybody just because it is such a great resource. So I hope you enjoyed our presentation today. Like I mentioned, feel free to reach out if you ever have any questions. I get people send me pictures of the plants all the time and ask me what they are. So I certainly don't mind doing that. But yeah, I just wanted to shout out our program, and please contact us if you have any questions, and I'd be happy to answer any that you have right now. So, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. I will start off our questions, and for people who have questions, you can just type them in the Q&A and we'll read them off as you have them. But I wanted to start off. So I was curious because I know sometimes we see where lakes are closed for swimming because of contamination from algae, which I think
Mhm.
like poses a risk of illness to people. Are there
Um,
other aquatic plants that can do that as well?
um, not particularly. So, we do have our Department of Energy and the Environment does monitor our lakes for um, harmful blue-green algae, which is a native naturally occurring algae. Not yet here in Nebraska, but I will say that poses a threat to human health. Now, there are other things in the southeast. There's a plant called hydrilla that has been found to actually carry some toxins that are actually poisoning bald eagles and other birds. So it's pretty far away from Nebraska right now, but thankfully, and we're hoping to keep it that way. But no, but thankfully, most of the issues that we have with people are if they're swimming, they're getting tangled in the weeds and things like that. So.
Thank you. And then I also wanted to ask, so how many of the aquatic invasive plants that we see in Nebraska do you know are escaped aquarium plants? Because I know a lot of the species we have in the US are plants that were originally sort of imported to go in
Mhm.
aquariums and then people dump aquariums. But are there any other places you see them come from as well or anything like that?
That's a fantastic question. A lot of the those big three that I talked about have been here a long time, besides Brunei, right? So, back in the 1800s, 1900s, the Nebraska Fish Commission actually stocked common carp in our water bodies for extended forage base, and it could have came from that as well. So, Eurasian water milfoil and curly pondweed, it's kind of hard to say where they came from. I will say that I didn't talk about these in my presentation. We have had instances of other invasive aquatic plants being dumped in our streams or ponds or lakes. So, my very first year I was here, there's a lake in Wilbur, and somebody had dumped in two floating plants called water hyacinth and water lettuce. And I had to go out there and literally walk around the entire lake in knee boots and scoop everything out. So there are, those plants shouldn't survive our winters. I say that, but it's kind of the Jurassic Park thing. Nature finds a way. There have been instances of these plants overwintering as well. So thankfully we haven't had as many issues with that, but we've seen neighboring states have those issues as well. For instance, the state of Iowa, they actually got a population of a plant called Brazilian elodea that came from someone's fish tank. So, you know, just because we haven't happened yet, it's still a very big risk because those plants, we don't exactly know where they come from or how they would, thrive in our water bodies or not. So, yeah, no, luckily we haven't had that happen yet, but we've already had a couple instances just since I've been here of people doing that. So, yep, it's definitely something that we still need to do a lot of outreach and education on because these species like water lettuce and water hyacinth. And I was just at a popular, I won't name it, plant and nursery store in Omaha, and they had tubs of water lettuce and water hyacinth. So that's just something to think about where we talk about the connections between private ownership and private ponds and our public water bodies.
Thank you. Yes, and Chris brings up a good point is that even though these plants are considered invasive, a lot of them you can buy at garden stores or online.
Mhm.
So we encourage you to do research about what plants you're getting for your aquarium, and especially plants you're going to put in your backyard or any sort of open area where they could easily get dispersed into new areas.
If I have a fish tank at home and I only use the plastic plants, I don't even mess with the real plants because especially the land work that we do, I said nope, I'm not doing live plants.
It's very smart. And we had one question pop up. So, are there differences between invasive plants in flowing water, rivers, streams versus lakes and ponds? Do some prefer certain habitats?
That's a fantastic question. We see most of these plants that I discussed today in our lake ecosystems, mainly because they like more of that static water where there's not a ton of flow. They can get more nutrients and things like that. But I will say we do have some of these species in our streams and rivers, right? Just because they're typically found in lakes doesn't mean that they can't establish their one of the big invasive aquatic plant that I didn't speak about, which is probably more relevant to our streams and rivers, is Phragmites or common reed. So, that's a very devastating wetland plant, riparian plant that grows on the edge of the water. That's actually a state noxious weed, which is really under the handled a lot by our weed superintendents and Department of Agriculture. So yeah, so that would be a good example of a plant that is a lot more common on our streams and rivers than a lake ecosystem as well. So, but there are some other ones that like, we don't have it in Nebraska, but across the country, that there are a few other species that do prefer that more flowing water than our lake ecosystems. But just thankfully, they haven't made their way to Nebraska yet.
Okay, thank you. And that seems to be our last question for now. So if you want to put your email back on the screen, Chris, that way
Sure.
if people have other questions pop up, they can just email you directly. Um, and also the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission Aquatic Invasive Species website is listed there as well. It's a great resource. There's a lot of information on aquatic invasive plants. But thank you so much. That was a great presentation. And thank you all for joining us for our final presentation for Nebraska Invasive Species Awareness Week. We really appreciate it. This recording will go up on the Nebraska Game and Park Commission's YouTube channel, so you'll be able to rewatch and share with others. But thank you all so much, and we hope to see you tomorrow for Know Your Nebraska Invasives Day at Pawnee State Recreation Area from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. Yes. Thank you so much and have a happy Nebraska Invasive Species Awareness Week.